Okay, well, let's go ahead and begin. So, I did just receive an update on Jerry Kite, so he actually did crack his fibula, so we'll remember him in prayer requests. I think, do we have any others that I need to record down for prayer requests this morning? Okay. Well, I see we have a few people drifting in real quick. Once they get settled, we'll go ahead and start with an opening prayer. Okay. Will you all join me in prayer? Dear Heavenly Father, God, we gather before you this morning and we thank you for this beautiful day that you've blessed us with. God, we thank you for being able to wake up with the breath of life in our lungs and to see the beauty of your creation around us as all creation sings your praises, God. God, we thank you for being able to gather together, whether it be in person or online, that we are able to come together and worship towards you. And God, we thank you that we have all the many amenities that we have been offered in this day and age, that we have a building to meet in, that we have air conditioning and all the sources for the entire Bible. We thank you for the education that we have in which we can delve into your word. God, we thank you for all the blessings that you pour out, both physical and spiritual. We thank you for your love, your grace, and your mercy. And we pray that as we dive into your word this morning, that we open our hearts and our ears and our eyes, and that we allow you to work upon us. God, we pray all these things in your Son, Jesus' most holy and precious name. Amen. Okay, if you haven't met me yet, my name is Cole Long. My wife and I have been here for several years. But we've been very quiet and just sort of balcony people, I guess you would say. But we're trying to be more active. And doing this lesson, I filled in on the intergenerational class a while back on actually Leviticus. And where this starts is my dad found this series of sermons on Leviticus, and he shared it with us. My dad is one of those people who goes, every time we have a family get-together or any sort of meeting, the Bible comes up in some form or fashion. So very soon, all my siblings and I were going through Leviticus, and there were a lot of good inputs in here. I was a little surprised at first. Leviticus has always been one of those books that it's the stopping stone from the yearly Read the Bible challenge. It's Leviticus, and if you can somehow get through Leviticus, then there's Numbers, and you just sort of, at least in my experience, I just sort of died every single time I was going, this is just sacrifice and this and unclean and clean and yada, yada, yada. We're in the New Testament. I know this matters, but it's very hard to get through and very hard to focus and sort of see the deeper meanings. So what I'm hoping to do in this class is sort of dive into Leviticus. We'll be going through some of the aspects of Leviticus, but also looking at the applications. So one important thing to note is, it is very often in our culture and our society today that we view God as almost two separate peoples, right? There's the God of the Old Testament and there's the God of the New Testament. And Old Testament God did all his things, but then Jesus came and everything sort of changed and God's different now. And it's important to remember that God has remained constant. God is outside of time. And that the same God that was in the Old Testament is the same God as in the New Testament. Now, that does not mean that there are not differences between Old Testament and New Testament. Jesus came to fulfill the law. He did not come to overwrite the law or take words away. He came to fulfill it and move us on to a new law and a new form of doing things. But the law had its purpose, and the nation of Israel had its purpose. And it's important that as we're diving in, to just sort of keep that in mind that this is the same God. These are the same applications. They just take a very different form. Jesus has not been sent yet. There is not salvation yet in its fullest form. There is just a shadow of what is yet to come, is a good way to think about that. So as we're diving into Leviticus, I just want to give a bit of background. This first lesson, for those that were in the I say intergenerational, it's the family builders class. Intergenerational is what Sunset calls theirs. But the family builders class, as we were diving into there, I sort of had a lesson and I went through it. This one is filled out quite a bit more. So you might hear some of the same things if you were in there. If not, then you're going to hear some new things. Well, you're going to hear new things regardless. But just letting you know, we are going to be covering Leviticus chapter 1 today. So we're going to be covering the burnt offering, if you want to go ahead and turn there. I debated doing a PowerPoint. I may do PowerPoints in the future. Letting you know, I taught a little bit at Tech, and I'm a blackboard and chalk kind of guy. I really don't like the technology. So we might have PowerPoints later, but today we're just going to be in God's Word. Okay? Not that we can't there, but just flipping through. So Leviticus is mainly in regard to priestly duties of the tribe of Israel. So Levitical duties. But it's important to note that there are several parts of Leviticus that actually refer to the practices of the tribe of Israel, or the nation of Israel, rather than just the tribe of Levi and Levitical priesthood. So it's also needed that the nation of Israel needs to know what the tribe of Levi is actually doing in worship for God. So Leviticus actually starts with the Hebrew word that is for and takes off right after Exodus. So I know that we have those in two different books today, but if we look back through it, it's really meant to be one continuous passage from Exodus to Leviticus. And where we leave off in Exodus is that God has just finished instructing Moses on building the tabernacle and setting certain things in the tabernacle, the whole setup of everything. So we have Moses in the end of Exodus, and he's going, okay, this is where you worship me. This is where you worship God. And this is how you worship God. So it's from a where to a how. Some things that we can already take away from this is God is dictating how to worship him. God is not saying, here's the tabernacle, go worship me. It is not something that is just people are allowed to do. God is a God of not of disorder, but of peace. And says in 2 Corinthians, God has a formality to worship and a way to approach him, and there is a set standard there. So in Leviticus is God showing his nation, this is where you were to worship, and this is how you are to go about that worship. This is how you are to approach me. Before we get to Leviticus, there are sacrifices mentioned in the Bible. So we have Melchizedek offered a sacrifice, but I'm going to focus on the burnt offering in particular, because that's what we're covering today. Noah offered a burnt offering after the flood. He offered a burnt offering to God. Abraham, in Genesis 22, Isaac was to be the burnt offering. So Isaac, when God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, Isaac was meant to be a burnt offering for God as well. So we get to Leviticus and we have this instructions on a burnt offering. Now, I'm not going to jump ahead quite yet. But when we get to it, it actually says in verse 2, when any of you brings an offering to the Lord. So Leviticus is already stating, not if you bring an offering to the Lord, or you must, it's when you bring an offering to the Lord. As in the nation of Israel already knows that they need to worship God, and the way they worship God is by offerings. And these are the dictations and sort of the formalities, and I don't want to say rules and regulations, but almost rules and regulations regarding that offering, the procedures and how to appropriately do so. There's also, of course, some expansion. There's a lot about the tribe of Levi and the priesting here. And the tribe of Levi and the priesthood wasn't formally established very well before this. So there are some new stuff there, but there was offerings previously, and this is just sort of a compilation of this is what God desires of you, and this is what this should look like. So, yes, here's how I am on my notes. Getting off. So I do want to note as well, I've just been through a bit of a study in Ephesians. We are chosen by God in the New Testament. The Israelites are chosen by God in the Old. So I want to bring that up as well and just say that. God chose the Israelites as a nation, and it talks about in Deuteronomy that they chose them not because they were the strongest or because they were the most numerous or anything else, but he chose them because he loved them. And similarly, we're called the chosen very often in the New Testament. And so there's this analogy that God had this special chosen people that he gave everything, and he gave his word, and that he actually wrote down in the Ten Commandments to give to the people, and they weren't able to get the job done. They weren't able to save themselves. They weren't able to save themselves from sin. For all men have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And then we move to the New Testament, and it's, you are all my chosen people. We have now moved to all the Gentiles as well. And all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, but Jesus has come for us as a perfect sacrifice and atonement with which to cleanse us from sin. So I do want to point that out as we're talking about this. This is for the chosen people of God, and we are the new chosen people of God. The entire summary of sort of Leviticus can be summed up in Leviticus 11, verse 45. So 11:45 says, I am the Lord who brought you up out of Egypt to be your God. Therefore be holy, for I am holy. So a lot of Leviticus, with all these rites and rituals, it is calling the people of Israel to be holy. And holy, we've always talked about, holy is set apart. It means to be different. He's calling them out of the nations in their practices and what they do, and he's also calling them out of the nations to be for him. It's not just be different than everyone else. It's be different than everyone else for me, for my sake, and in my in worship towards me. So, this is also reflected in the New Testament. I'm going to flip over to, I've got all my markers mixed up here. 1 Peter 1, 15 through 16 says, but just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do, for it is written, be holy because I am holy. So that's a quote from Leviticus as well. So we weren't just called to be holy and separate in the Old Testament, but in the New. Now, with all that being said and all the preamble, let's go ahead and dive into actually starting Leviticus chapter 1. So I'm not going to read all of it, but I will read the first section. So Leviticus 1:1, the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. He said, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when any of you brings an offering to the Lord, bring as your offering an animal from either the herd or the flock. If the offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he is to offer a male without defect. He must present it at the entrance to the tent of meeting so that it will be acceptable to the Lord. He is to lay his hands on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted on his behalf to make atonement for him. He is to slaughter the young bull before the Lord, and then Aaron's sons, the priest, shall bring the blood and sprinkle it against the altar on all sides at the entrance to the tent of meeting. He is to skin the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. The sons of Aaron and the priest are to put fire on the altar and arrange wood on the fire. Then Aaron's sons, the priest, shall arrange the pieces according to the head, including the head and the fat on the burning wood that is on the altar. He is to wash the inner parts and the legs with water, and the priest is to burn all of it on the altar. It is a burnt offering, an offering made by fire, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. Now, so this is talking about the bull. This is the offering from the herd. Next, there's the offering from the flock. So it's talking about a male sheep or goat. That's the next section. And then the final section is an offering of a dove or young pigeon. You might see dove or turtle dove, and how to appropriately prepare that. The bull and the sheep and goat are pretty similar on how they're all prepared. The birds are a little different. I'll actually note now the user butchers. The worshiper butchers the animal. This is something I'd never really realized in Leviticus. I'd been trying to read it, as a younger individual multiple times, and I could never get much. But the worshiper comes. He is to offer a meal without defect. He must present it at the tent of meeting. He is to lay his hand on it, and he is to slaughter the young bull before the Lord. That is not the priest doing these actions. That is actually the worshiper taking upon himself. So we'll dive in a bit into this in a sec. Do want to note there's the bull, there's the male sheep or goat, and then there's the pigeon or the dove. Now, without defect, that means that these bulls, or these animals, I should say, are valuable. These are generally the males. These are what you would want as a sort of a breeding male. You don't want to use your old bull that's blind. If you have a bull that's blind and you have a bull that's young and strong and without any issues, God's saying, I want that one. I don't want your old blind. You do not bring me your leftovers. You do not bring me your junk. I am your God, and you bring me what is appropriate to worship God. So these are all male. These are all strong. They're all, I want to note too, they're all clean animals. I was reading one of the commentaries, so they're all clean. It's not unclean. These are not animals that are, oh, well, we're the Israelites, and we're only allowed to eat clean animals, but we've raised some pigs for God. No, it is actual, usable food and product for the Israelite nation. It's also owned. I hadn't picked up on this at first. They are not allowed to go out and capture these sort of wild animals. These are their animals. These are their bulls and their sheep and goats. Okay? It offers a little bit of a connection there and a personal sacrifice, that's where that word comes from, on the part of the user. So God does not accept any blemish. He does not accept if you have a lame bull. You can't just give your leftovers. You can't just give anything. I do want to note, too, that the burnt offering is not actually required on an individual's behalf. Required by individuals. As we read here, so if the offering, when any of you brings you, it doesn't actually say that you're required to give a burnt offering to the Lord. There is burnt offerings that are given on the behalf of the community very often, but an private individual is not required to give it. But when they do give it, these are how it's supposed to follow the statutes. And so, I'm trying to think. It's on the tip of my tongue. As the individual is giving it, well, I had a thought and it left me, so we're just going to move right along. Now, this sacrifice, yes, is made for atonement. So if we see in verse 4, he lays his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted on his behalf to make atonement. So this offering is later given when people request something of God. Occasionally people request something of God, and they go and give a burnt offering. It is to make atonement for him. So atonement means to cover over. It is to cover over. Specifically, I was looking, in the Hebrew it talks about, it is a person, so if I have offended someone, I would give a gift to cover over their face. That's originally what it meant. Its definition changed a little bit over time to be more like ransom and cover over completely, but initially that's what it was, it's to cover over. So it is to cover over the sin that mankind has committed, cover over the iniquities and failings to make right before God. Now, it is to cover over. I want to talk about the hand on the head. So the hand on the head, the worshiper brings in this bull. He stops at the first, and the priests look over to see whether it's an acceptable sacrifice. Now, that's to stop the people of Israel, of course, from bringing in their lame and their leftovers and whatever else. But they bring in over the good. The priest looks at it. Everyone goes, this is a good animal. They bring it up, and the worshiper lays their hand on the head. This is supposed to symbolize a sort of transference, a sort of, I have sinned and I have done wrong, and you are dying on my behalf, and you are going to die on my behalf. And then the worshiper takes the bull and butchers it. And so you can imagine it's a pretty grisly scene as they're butchering a bull in front of the altar. And then the priest takes the parts of the bull and puts it on the altar. And we'll get into that in a sec, but it's not a very clean picture by any means. And God is sitting there going, this is the price of sin. This is the price of sin. This is the price of sin. And blood is required, life is required in order to make atonement. So I want to note as well that as we're talking about it, we have the three different scenarios. Now, why did God say you can give a bull, or you can give a sheep or a goat, or you can give a pigeon or a turtle dove? Well, if we see in John 4:23 talks about God is seeking worshipers. God is seeking those that worship him. So by offering these three different categories, what God has done is opened the doors of worship to the community of Israel, to the entire community of Israel. So God has said, okay, if you are rich and you are wealthy and you have a herd of bulls and you're able to afford these, then this is what you bring to me. If you are sort of middle class and you can't afford a herd of bulls, but you have sheep or goats, this is what you bring to me. And if you are very poor, then you go get a dove or a pigeon, young pigeon, and that's what you bring to me. And so there's three different categories here that God has offered. I also want to note that there's no limit on the number of pigeons or doves, so that they can bring one, or they can bring multiple. And this is a way for God to sort of open up worship and to have worship enabled to all the people of Israel. Now, I want to point out that as we approach God today, we should have the same thoughts in mind. God has opened up worship to everyone. There is no barrier. There is no restrictions on you can come worship God. With that being said, the different things that were offered, there is no barrier to worshiping God. I'm sorry, my train of thought's a little all over this morning. But with all of these being offered to God in the different categories, there is still a requirement to give of oneself to worship God. Never did God say you can give a burnt offering without giving anything to burn. He said, you have to bring this. You have to come before the Lord, and you have to give of yourself, of your financial, in this case it's physical means, but it's of yourself with which to worship God. It is not a free worship. It's not a free exchange. You know, very often today, and I preach as, I say this as one of the people who's been really bad about it, especially it's been a struggle recently with the 1.5-year-old, but trying to focus with reverence and give of myself in worship. And this refers to the singing in worship. This refers to the praise, to the prayers. It's very difficult to focus. And God is demanding that. He's demanding that excellence in the sacrifices that we bring. The sacrifices today are of singing, of a praise, of a contribution. It's a giving of oneself, and it should take from oneself. It should not just be I just came to church today, I clocked in, and I clocked out, and I did my due worship to God. The Israelites that are offering these sacrifices are bloody. They have butchered an animal. They are going, this was mine. This was my sin. I am face to face with the reality of the situation and where I stand in opposition to God. And this is how I can make atonement for myself. Now, it's important to look at all of these things and to just see the fullness as they grow together and how they're applied today. It's also important that the entire offering is consumed. So often as we get into these other sacrifices and such, often there's like a portion set aside for the priest, right? The priest, can't remember which one it is off the top of my head, but you know, they get to stick a fork in, or they get to eat this, or that's how the priests sort of take care of themselves. That's not the case in the burnt offering. The burnt offering, it's all consumed. It is all God's. And God goes, that is all mine. This is all given to me. This is complete. This is all-consuming worship is how we can think about it. So, if I hop over to Deuteronomy 10, verse 12, says, "And now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to observe the Lord's commands and decrees that I am giving you today for your own good." There is this sense of all-encompassing, all-consuming worship towards God. We see the same thing in Romans. So Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. So Romans 12, 1 and 2 says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So we are now called to be living sacrifices, and that is called a spiritual act of worship. Just as the Old Testament had this physical act of worship, we are called to have this spiritual. And I want to point out that as we're going through this, we also must remember in Psalms, it says, "For you do not delight in sacrifices." It's not about the sacrifices that God is dictating to the nation of Israel. It's about the heart behind the sacrifices. It's about the faith through which obedience is sort of nurtured and grown. So all is consumed, just as in the burnt offering, we should have an all-consuming worship today. We should not have any barriers or hold back. Matthew 6:33, I have this one written down. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. So seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. It should be an all-consuming. It shouldn't be just a Sunday morning. It shouldn't be just, I'm coming here, I'm offering my sacrifice, or I'm giving a prayer. It should be a continual, all-consuming offering to God. Now, speaking of the offering to God, let's talk about what it means at the end when it says, or in verse 9, it is a burnt offering, an offering made by fire, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. So, we talked about this a good while in the Family Builders class. An aroma pleasing to the Lord. This is a burnt animal on a big altar of fire. This is not just one burnt animal. This is a lot of burnt animals, with blood sprinkled around the edges, and you just butchered an animal, and you've got all this. There's the ash and the birds, what do they call it? The crop. Yeah, that's what it's called. The crop with its contents is thrown with the ash. There's organs. I mean, it's a disgusting place. It's a disgusting smell. And I can't imagine anyone anywhere near in the nation of Israel could not have stepped by and gone, the tabernacle's right there. I know it. I can smell it. It's right there. But God calls that an aroma pleasing to the Lord. And I want to point out this is not the only time it's used. It will jump a few times to the New Testament. But this is not a pleasant smell. And this isn't given just on, I said it was for the private individuals. This offering is also given on every morning, every evening, every month, every Sabbath, and on feast. It talks about that in Numbers. And this fire doesn't go out, and that's just looking at the burnt offering. That's not looking at any of the other offerings that are being given on the altar. So there is a lot of death, and there is a lot of smell, and this is not a very pleasant place to be around. And with all of that, God says, this is pleasing to the Lord. And what God is looking at is that this obedience is pleasing to the Lord, this act of worship, this atonement, this giving of oneself to the Lord. We look in Philippians 4:18. So Paul is talking about gifts from Epaphroditus. I think I said that right. Epaphroditus is giving gifts to Paul, and it is called a fragrant offering, an acceptable sacrifice, pleasing to the Lord. So we see gift giving is also called as a fragrant offering. We also see in Ephesians 5:1 and 2. I'm going to actually turn to this one. So Ephesians 5:1 and 2 says, "Be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." So Christ himself, in giving his life on the cross for us, is also compared as a fragrant offering before God. It is the obedience, it is the sense of giving of oneself fully to God, which he perceives as a pleasant aroma, a fragrant offering. It is not the stench of dead and dying animals being burnt continuously over a bonfire. It is the act of submission to God's will rather than submission to mankind's own. So as we've looked, we have talked about, the offerings and how they all different present themselves. There is that blood and the stench. There is the submission to God's will completely. And I think this portrays a lot to worship. So as we talk about this, and I say worship today, worship today, worship today. What does that mean to worship today? When we are gathered together or whether we are in our lives, it's important. It's also, I say important, it is valuable to note that in Leviticus and through the law as being given to Moses and through Moses to the old, or through Moses, not to Moses, through Moses to the peoples of the time, that there is a direction and there are laws given regarding worship as we would consider it in sort of as those outside the church consider worship. As you meet together, you worship and you go home and you're no longer worshiping. But there are also laws regarding every aspect of daily life. There's regarding who you can marry. There's all these Old Testament laws. And just as the New Testament, Christ talks about it no longer being, I tell you, do not murder, but do not think angry. Do not have anger in your heart. There is this correlation between worship is not just restricted to the actual act itself, but rather to the individual's lives and every aspect of the individual's lives. So it's important to think that as we're talking about this consuming and this perfection of worship, that we consider our lives and look at our lives and every aspect of our lives and see how that is being applied within. Now, that all being said, we also must remember that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and that we are not able to do it ourselves, and we're not able to attain this perfection that we are continually striving for by ourselves. However, through the acts of the Holy Spirit and through the sacrifice of Christ and what Christ has granted us, we are able to uplift ourselves more and more so towards this perfection and to have our blemishes covered over with this atonement, this sort of covering from God, this ultimate covering, which not only covers but washes away. So God has called Israel to be holy, and God has called us to be holy. God has used Leviticus and his law given through Moses to dictate to us how we are to be chosen. As we're going to continue diving through this, I wanted this to be pretty introductory. As we're going to continue through this, we need to continually be thinking about Jesus and how this relates to Jesus through everything. So Jesus took the role of the offer. Jesus was praying to God and was coming before the Lord, praying to the Lord. He also took the role as the mediator. So as the priest would take the butchered offering and give it to the Lord, Christ takes our offerings, brings them to the Lord, and then Jesus took on the role of the sin offering itself. He's not only the great high priest and one who has prayed to God and called upon God, he is now the great high priest in the order of Melchizedek, which is set up before the Levitical order. And he is also the sin offering, which was given to God. So he is all three components of what we see already in the burnt offering, before we even delve into the rest of Leviticus. A few things to pop on as well. So, as I said, the priest is actually offering the bird. I don't know why the priest is offering the bird versus the actual participant offering the bird. It's never actually stated. The priest just sort of tears the bird. This is also the same way that it's Abraham. I'm struggling to remember where. But Abraham actually, when he gave, I can't remember if it was doves or pigeons even, but Abraham, when he offered, was offering in the same way. It's the exact same way with the ripping and everything else. I believe it's when God's setting his covenant with Abraham. Abraham gives an offering there that's similar to this and follows the same direction. So that lends some more things. I do want to point out a few other things that I noticed that as I was going through commentaries, and I've heard some things, of other biblical scholars I was really surprised at. So there are a few pot shots taken at the book of Leviticus. One of the most prevalent ones is from the atheist point of view, right? So the atheist point of view is coming to the church and looking at the church and looking at the Old Testament and going, oh, well, the Old Testament's just a bunch of writings. And Leviticus, you know, it was put together over a very long period of time. And what happened is every time the Old Testament prophets came up with something, they put something in Leviticus. And so they just added to Leviticus over time. The evidences do not support that or show that with the recordings that we have, with the regard that's been given. There's, I was very happy with, well, my wife gave a very good answer when I mentioned this to her. Because I said, hey, I'm reading this study, and it's talking about the pigeons and doves. And so, for example, one commentary was saying, well, they couldn't have had pigeons and doves because they were in the wilderness, you know. How are you going to have pigeons and doves in the wilderness? That's really a more urban thing. And incense is mentioned later on in the book. How are they going to have the ingredients for incense? Those are difficult to get. And I really appreciated my wife. Her immediate response was, didn't they take everything from Egypt? Didn't they just load up before they left? And they did. So I would imagine that they would have the incense and they would have things, and that they would be able to access these pigeons and doves as they're wandering in the wilderness. Another important thought that I immediately had after that was, we have just finished reading the book of Exodus, and we have just finished reading of all the miracles of God. And we're not that far from Genesis and from the creation of the world itself and all the miracles wherein. And we have manna that God is granting to the people of Israel. We have God providing food in the form of manna to the people of Israel. And it is astounding to me that we have biblical scholars, individuals which have the title of biblical scholars. Maybe I should say that. I don't mean that to be derogatory, but it is astounding to me the lack of faith in God's power to provide and to perform miracles and to take care of his people when he has dictated laws, when we have just read about all of God's miracles and power. And it is just, it was just, why on earth would you believe, if it is not worth believing that God is able to provide for his people, that which he has dictated must be done, then God cannot perform the simplest of miracles, much less part the Red Sea or do anything else. There is a group that does not want to attribute the Pentateuch completely to Moses. I've heard of this one several times before. Jesus actually refers to it a few times, talking about it being from Moses. And traditionally, in the Jewish faith, Israelites, well before Christians, it has always been attributed to Moses throughout. And there are a lot of similarities with Moses. I will say, I think the offering and the time span discrepancy, and people sort of think that it was written later, comes really from the fact that there were sacrifices that predate Leviticus and sacrifices after. Cain and Abel. So when we get to the grain offering and such, Cain and Abel both present offerings to God, you know? And Cain's is not pleasing to the Lord, but Abel's is. And we're not exactly specified why. There is an indication that Cain perhaps did not give the best of his first fruit, or give the best of his crop, or the first fruits or the best of his crop, but those are all suppositions, and they're not actually specifically detailed in the Bible. But there is this act of, there are sacrifices present, and there are sacrifices given to the Lord, and that has somehow been passed to the people of Israel before in times past. However, now we've come to a time where this is going to be written down, this is going to be formalized, and this is going to be standardized in the worship of God. It is not going to be some individuals passing it down. I'm sure Abraham and Isaac and Jacob passed down, this is what you do to worship God, this is what you do to worship God. But now that the nation of Israel has grown and just come from Egypt, this is going to be more standardized and formalized, I think is a good way to say it. So, I know that's the first bell. That's It's not all I have, but I don't want to get into the rest of what I have this morning. I'm curious if anyone has any comments on that and how and what we've talked about this morning. Yes?
One of the things that strikes me, especially when you talk about how bloody it was, and that the person who was bringing the offering was actually doing the slaughter. So they're going to be intimately involved.
Yes.
As we've been talking about building a new building, one of the things that we've emphasized over and over is that we want the sound to be good for our singing and for our worship. And unfortunately, in many places, and many people who look at church buildings anymore, it's a spectator thing. They make the sound for the person up front on the stage, and nobody out here needs to hear anything. Only those band on the stage or the choir on the stage is the only person that hears it. That's not what God required here. It wasn't a spectator sport.
It is a participant through and through. It is not one-sided. You do not hand off your sacrifice and go, here, why don't you give an offering to the Lord? I'm going to go leave and go about my day. You are active and you are present, and I mean, you are bloodied here. You have the blood of sin on your hands, literally, as you're giving this offering to God. Mm-hmm. Yes?
I couldn't help but think about the sacrifices being owned, and then coming back to Jesus and the money tables and the sacrifices in the temple. Those sacrifices apparently were bought and then turned around and turned in. Mm-hmm. There was not that sacrifice
of oneself. Now, I thought about that too. I think it depends probably because you are still giving of monetary means. You're no longer giving of animal means, but you're giving of monetary means. I think where it all boils down to, as with most Bible issues, is a sense of the heart and of the attitude with which you're approaching the Lord. I had similar thoughts because I was like, well, if it's owned, then how's that? And then I was like, well, pigeons and turtle doves, are they not catching those? But they would have been raising some of them as how it probably would have been taken. Yes?
Another little brief thought, where it says in verse 9, burn all of it on the altar.
Yes.
That's where we get our word Holocaust. Burn everything means burn it all up. And so that name was applied by the Jews to the Holocaust of the Nazis.
Okay. Thank you. I didn't actually know that. I'll say it again for the video. So that word, to burn all of it, that's the word where we get the word Holocaust from. So there is this completion. Yes?
You're talking about the blood and the gore and all the things that were going on. Excited about that. Of course, they were right on the edge of the valley, so all the blood went on down through there, so it would cool up and that type of thing. But it was offensive, smelly. It was offensive and smelly when Christ was sacrificed. He was bleeding. His back was against me, and then he was stabbed with a sword, and the blood coming out. So this continues on as far as the sacrifice. It was completeness, and there's no holding back. It's all in on it. And so I thought that still tied in with how the Israelites had to worship back then. With all the blood.
I agree. I think that's a very good point. So I'll repeat it again. So the sacrifice of Christ was in a similar fashion with the blood and with the just amount of in your face that this is a horrific scene also occurred with the sacrifice of Christ and with the stabbing inside and the blood flowing down there. And what all we perceived there beforehand, I would even say. Okay, well, I think that's the second bell. Thank you all so much. Next week, we'll be continuing on the grain offering, which has some real interesting inputs as well. I'm excited for the grain offering as well.